Hey everyone, thanks for sending in those really interesting sources all about early literacy and how those little ones learn to read, connect with stories and everything.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating area.
Yeah, and it seems like everyone's got a different idea about, what works best and all that.
Oh, absolutely. Tons of approaches and theories out there for sure.
So for this deep dive, we're going to focus in on one specific technique that seems super promising for giving preschoolers a real boost in literacy.
Okay, sounds good.
We're going to look at what happens when you combine reading aloud in a way that really gets them engaged with getting those little bodies moving, active participation.
I love that idea because the sources you sent really zero in on that very thing, the potential of combining dialogic reading with physical action.
Right. And, I was struck by how much research there is in this area.
Ah, tons. There's a whole body of work on it.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that it looks like putting these two things together, interactive reading and movement,
Hmm.
can actually have a pretty huge positive effect on how well these little kids learn.
That's definitely what the research suggests. So let's unpack that.
Yeah. Let's start with this study by Wall and some other researchers from
Right.
2021. Their work really seems to be at the heart of this whole idea.
Okay.
So what were they really trying to figure out with their research? What was the big question driving them?
Well, their central question was really smart, actually. They were curious about whether incorporating physical actions into story time could make dialogic reading even more effective for young kids. So does getting the body involved actually boost the learning that's already happening with dialogic reading?
Makes sense.
Okay.
So they weren't just looking at dialogic reading in isolation, they were looking at it in combination with something else.
Exactly. That's the key here. It's about this powerful synergy between reading and movement.
And how did they design their study to test this out? What did they actually do with the kids?
Okay, so they had 29 preschoolers in the study, ages between 3 and 5, and they divided them into 3 groups.
Okay, classic study design.
Right, so one group was the control group, and these kids simply listened to a story being read aloud to them 8 times.
8 times. Okay,
Yeah.
so quite a bit of exposure.
Yeah, to make sure it stuck. Then there was the dialogic, then embodied group.
Okay, so two parts to their experience.
Right, for their first 4 sessions, they did dialogic reading, and then for the next 4, they added physical actions into the mix.
Got it. So a shifted approach halfway through.
Exactly. And the third group, the embodied, then dialogic group, did things the other way around.
Ah, so they flipped the order.
Exactly. They started with 4 sessions of acting out the story, and then they added the dialogic reading for the last 4.
Fascinating. So three different pathways to experiencing the same story.
Precisely different combinations and different timings.
I'm curious, when you say embodied action, can you paint a picture of what that actually looked like? Were these kids like putting on full-blown theatrical productions?
Haha. Not quite Broadway level, but definitely engaging and active. So in the study, the embodied action part meant the children were using toys to physically act out different parts of the story as the adult read it aloud. Imagine bringing the story to life right there in the room through play and movement.
Oh, I see. So like if the story mentioned a character walking through a forest, the child might actually move a toy character across the floor.
Exactly, that sort of thing. They're embodying the actions of the story with their own bodies and with the help of toys.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense, and it sounds super fun for the kids.
Oh, absolutely. They were really into it.
So three different ways of experiencing the same story. What did they actually find? What were the big takeaways?
Well, the results were really eye-opening. They found that adding this physical action component to story time led to some pretty significant improvements in a few key areas.
Okay, like what specifically?
Well, first off, the kids who moved and played along with the story, they actually remembered more of what happened afterwards. So, better story recall.
That makes sense. If you're actively involved, you're probably going to retain more.
Right, exactly. It's not just passive listening, you're creating a deeper connection. And they also picked up and remembered more new words from the story.
So their vocabulary expanded more.
Exactly, greater vocabulary acquisition. And maybe most importantly, the study also noticed an increase in positive affect amongst the kids who were physically engaged.
Oh, so they actually enjoyed story time more when they were moving and playing.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just about learning the words and the plot, it was about creating a positive and enjoyable experience.
That's huge because if they're having fun, they're going to be more motivated to keep learning.
Exactly. Motivation is key. And the study also talked about the effect sizes being generally large. Can I just touch on that for a sec?
Yeah, please do, because I think people hear that phrase and they're not always sure what it means.
Right. So when researchers talk about effect size, they're essentially measuring how big of an impact something is having. And In this case, a large effect size tells us that the differences they saw between those groups, those improvements in memory, vocabulary, and enjoyment, they were substantial, not just some random blip on the radar.
Ah, so it wasn't just a tiny difference. It was a meaningful difference.
Well, think of it this way. If you were trying two different methods to teach a child their ABCs, a large effect size would mean one method was noticeably more effective than the other.
Oh, okay. So like a real world difference you can actually see.
Precisely. And that's what's so exciting about these findings. It really highlights that combining embodied action with dialogic reading isn't just a good idea. It seems to be a significantly more effective approach.
And that's a big deal for anyone who's working with kids.
Yeah.
Parents, teachers, librarians.
Absolutely. It's a real takeaway for anyone invested in early literacy.
It makes you wonder why this combination works so well. I
No.
mean, is it just that kids are having more fun, or is there something deeper going on?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the study actually touches on this, and it delves into the idea of embodied processes.
Embodied process. Okay, let's unpack that a bit because I think it's a key concept here.
So the authors of the study propose this really fascinating idea. They suggest that maybe the benefits we typically attribute to dialogic reading could actually be driven by these fundamental embodied processes.
So it's not just the back and forth conversation, the asking questions part of dialogic reading, but it's what our bodies are doing during that interaction that's making the real difference.
That's the thought, and it connects to this bigger concept called embodied cognition. Have you heard of that?
Oh yeah, it's a pretty big idea in a bunch of different fields, isn't it?
It is. It's this notion that our thinking, including how we understand language, isn't just happening in our brains. It's deeply intertwined with our physical experiences and how we interact with the world.
So it's like our bodies are providing this real-world context for the abstract ideas we encounter in stories, like a physical anchor for learning.
Precisely. And there's other research that supports this idea. The article cites studies on something called embodied reading, which shows how physical actions can actually help us comprehend text. And there's work showing that both doing an activity and even just imagining doing it can boost reading comprehension in young kids.
That's wild. So even just thinking about doing something can have an effect on our understanding.
Right. It's like our brains are wired to connect action and understanding in a really deep way.
So if you're reading a story about building a tower and you're actually stacking blocks as you read, your comprehension goes up.
Exactly. Or even if you're just visualizing yourself stacking blocks, it can have a similar effect.
Wow, that really changes how I think about reading. I always saw it as this purely mental activity, but this research suggests it's much more of a whole body experience.
Absolutely. It's engaging the mind on the body.
Okay, now you've mentioned dialogic reading a few times. Can you just give a quick recap for anyone who might not be totally familiar with what that actually entails?
Sure thing. So dialogic reading is essentially an interactive way of reading aloud with a child. It's not just the adult reading the words on the page. It's about creating a conversation around the story. The adult prompts the child to get involved by asking questions, encouraging them to describe the pictures, guess what might happen next, connect the story to their own life.
So it's about making it a shared experience, not just a passive listening experience.
Precisely. And there are different techniques you can use, like something called crowd prompts, which are just different types of questions to get kids thinking, asking them to complete a sentence, remember something that happened, predict what might happen next, or relate the story to their own experiences.
So making those connections between the story and the child's own world.
Exactly. And the research shows this can really boost comprehension and engagement.
But the study also brought up a really interesting point about how this approach might not be used the same way by everyone in every family or culture.
Oh, that's crucial to acknowledge. Yeah, the article mentions that not all parents naturally engage in this kind of question asking during shared reading.
Right, so it's not a universal practice.
Exactly. And they point to some research suggesting that certain groups like Latino parents, especially those with less formal education or who are newer to the U.S., might not instinctively ask a lot of comprehension questions when reading with their kids.
And that raises a really important point about cultural differences and how we approach early literacy.
Absolutely. We need to be sensitive to those differences and think about how different families might engage with stories in different ways.
So if dialogic reading isn't necessarily a natural fit for all families, could adding the physical action piece help bridge that gap, offer a different way for kids to engage?
That's a really interesting possibility, and I think that's where the real potential of embodied action comes in. Even if a parent isn't naturally asking lots of questions during story time, encouraging the child to physically interact with the story through play could be a more intuitive and accessible way to build that deeper engagement and understanding.
So it could be a more inclusive approach to early literacy.
I think so. It might tap into more universal ways that children learn and engage with stories, regardless of the specific questioning styles used in their homes.
That's a really powerful idea, and it's important to remember that dialogic reading on its own is already a well-established and effective method for boosting early literacy skills. I mean, the study itself even mentions research showing that it works.
Oh, yeah, it's got a strong track record.
So what does this new research really add to the conversation?
What's exciting about it is that it adds a new dimension to what we already know about dialogic reading. It suggests that by adding physical action, we might not just be making a good thing a little better. We might be tapping into a more fundamental way that young children understand and learn from stories.
So it's not just an incremental improvement, it's a potentially transformative shift in how we approach early literacy.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the power of the body in the learning process.
Okay, so we've talked about the study, the findings, the potential mechanisms at play. Let's bring this back to our listener. If someone's working with young kids, has young kids at home, or is just interested in this whole topic of learning, what are the big takeaways? What should they remember?
The most practical takeaway is the power of combining these two approaches. If you're reading with young children, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a caregiver, think about how you can weave in simple physical actions or use toys to act out parts of the story.
It doesn't have to be anything complicated, right?
Not at all. Even just having a child pretend to be a character walking across the room or using a stuffed animal to represent a key figure in the story. These simple actions can make a big difference.
So it's about making the story come alive through movement.
Exactly. And you're creating this multisensory experience. You're engaging their hearing through the reading their language skills, through the conversation, and their sense of movement through the physical actions. And this combination seems to create a much richer and more memorable learning experience.
It's like when you physically walk a route, you're more likely to remember it than if you just look at a map.
Precisely, your body creates another pathway for the information to be stored and retrieved.
Okay, so to sum things up for everyone, the big takeaway here is that combining interactive reading, that dialogic reading, with encouraging kids to physically act out parts of the story looks incredibly promising for boosting those essential early literacy skills. Like remembering the story and learning new words.
Absolutely. And it's really making us rethink the role of the body in reading. It's not just a mental activity, it's a whole body experience.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to ponder, given these findings. How might we need to reimagine our traditional approaches to teaching young children to read? And even taking it a step further, what other ways could we be leveraging this connection between our bodies and our minds to enhance learning at all ages, not just for little kids?
Those are great questions. Really food for thought.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of early literacy and embodied learning.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep those minds and bodies active.
And keep exploring.